Lady Ilara Sterling considered the ballroom a particular sort of purgatory. It was a kaleidoscope of vibrant silks and flashing jewels, a symphony of forced laughter and the delicate clinking of crystal. For her, it was a place of profound invisibility. She stood near a potted palm, the fronds offering a meagre shield from the swirling currents of the London season. Her gown, a modest grey silk, was designed to blend into the shadows, a task at which she had become an expert. From this vantage point, she watched her younger sister, Clara, a vision in pale rose, holding court near the dance floor. Clara was everything Ilara was not, luminous, effervescent, and unblemished. Ilara's own reflection, when she chanced to catch it in the glossy surface of a window pane, was always a quiet shock. It was not the plainness of her features, but the single defining flaw that drew the eye and held it. A scar, pale and silvery, ran from the edge of her left eyebrow down to her cheekbone. A permanent crescent moon etched into her skin. A childhood memory of fire and fear. Her mother had once called it a tragedy. Now, she simply called it an impediment. Ilara knew it for what it was, a wall. It kept the world at a polite distance, ensuring she remained firmly on the shelf, a spinster in the making at 22. A sense of resignation had long ago settled in her bones, a quiet, melancholic companion. Her life was a placid lake, its surface undisturbed by the ripples of hope or expectation. Her mother found her expression a familiar mixture of maternal affection and societal anxiety. "Ilara, dearest, you cannot spend the entire evening conversing with the flora," she whispered, her fan fluttering like a nervous bird. "The palm is an excellent listener, mother. It offers no tedious opinions on the quality of the punch," Ilara replied, her voice low. Her mother sighed, a sound heavy with years of disappointment. "Lord Finchley is here. He has been watching Clara. It would be a most suitable match. Our finances, well, you know our situation." Ilara's fingers tightened on her own simple fan. She knew their situation intimately. Her father's poor investments had left them dangling precariously over the abyss of genteel poverty. Clara's marriage was not just a hope, it was a necessity. And Lord Finchley, a portly man with a damp handshake and an air of smug satisfaction, was their best prospect. Ilara felt a familiar, protective ache for her sister. "Clara deserves better than a man who appraises her like livestock," she murmured. "We cannot afford better, Ilara. We can only afford solvent," her mother corrected gently, her gaze flicking towards Ilara's scarred cheek for a fraction of a second. The unspoken sentiment hung between them. If only you were whole, perhaps our burden would be lighter. Just then, a hush fell over the room. A sudden extinguishing of sound that was more profound than any noise. The conversations faltered. The laughter died like a candle running out of air. Ilara followed the collective gaze of the room toward the grand entrance. He stood there, as if carved from winter stone. The Duke of Alistair. Alistair Vance. A man spoken of in whispers, a figure of immense power and wealth, known for his cold demeanor and ruthless business dealings. He was tall and severe, dressed in immaculate black that seemed to absorb the light around him. His face was a mask of aristocratic indifference, his eyes sweeping over the glittering assembly with an expression of profound boredom. He did not walk into a room. He occupied it, forcing everyone else to become mere scenery. Ilara had never seen him so close. He was less a man and more a force of nature, a storm cloud on a summer's day. A shiver, cold and unwelcome, traced a path down her spine. She saw Lord Finchley, puffed up with self-importance, approach a small group of his cronies near the punch bowl. Their laughter was loud and boorish. Ilara's attention drifted, but then she caught her own name, a word snagged from the air. Her head snapped back. The The Sterling sisters, Finchley was saying, gesturing vaguely with his glass. One a diamond of the first water, the other, well, damaged goods. His friends snickered. A young viscount added, "A shame about the older one. A decent dowry might have polished that dull stone, but with the Sterling fortunes, I imagine it's quite hopeless. One would have to be desperate to take on a wife who frightens the horses." Finchley sneered, his gaze landing on Alara with cruel amusement. "I suppose I shall have to content myself with the pretty one. A man must make sacrifices." The words fell like stones into the frozen pond of Alara's composure. Humiliation, hot and sharp, pricked at the back of her eyes. She wanted to shrink, to disappear entirely into the shadows of the palm. But she did not disappear, because at that moment, the Duke of Alistair, who had been standing nearby, turned his head slowly. His unnervingly still gaze fell upon Lord Finchley's group. The air around them seemed to crystallize. He moved with a silent, predatory grace. He did not hurry, yet he was upon them in a moment. Lord Finchley and his friends fell into a sudden, panicked silence, their faces paling under the Duke's frigid stare. "You were discussing marriage," the Duke of Alistair said. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the lingering music of the ballroom like a shard of ice. It was a voice accustomed to absolute obedience. Finchley stammered, "Your Grace, merely idle chatter." "I have no time for idle chatter," the Duke stated flatly. He looked from Finchley to the Viscount, his expression one of utter contempt. Then, he did something that stopped Alara's breath in her throat. His gaze moved past them, across the room, and landed directly on her. For a terrifying second, she felt pinned by his stare, utterly exposed. "I find myself in need of a wife," the Duke continued, his voice resonating in the stunned silence. "A duchess is a practical requirement, not a romantic whim. I have no patience for the coquetries of the season." He paused, his eyes still locked on Alara. "I'll marry the ugly one." He lifted a single, elegant finger and pointed, directly at her. The world tilted on its axis. A collective gasp swept through the room. Alara felt 100 pairs of eyes turn to her, no longer invisible, but horrifyingly, painfully seen. The palm fronds offered no protection. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. The Duke's words were a public brand, a declaration of her worthlessness that was somehow, impossibly, twisted into a proposal of marriage. It was the cruelest, most bewildering moment of her life. He had destroyed her with a sentence, and in the same breath, he had irrevocably shattered the quiet stagnation of her world. The following morning arrived with a funereal stillness. Alara had not slept. The Duke's words echoed in the chambers of her mind, a relentless, mocking refrain. "I'll marry the ugly one." It was a pronouncement of such casual cruelty that it stole her breath each time she thought of it. She sat by her window, watching the pale dawn bleed across the sky, feeling as though she were a ghost in her own life. Her family was in a state of suspended disbelief. Her mother fluttered between hysteria and avarice, while her father had sequestered himself in his study, awaiting the inevitable. Clara had wept, not from jealousy, but from a horrified sympathy for her sister. At precisely 10 o'clock, the Duke of Alistair's carriage, a severe black lacquered coach pulled by 4 perfectly matched greys, arrived. It did not roll up to their door. It materialized, a somber omen. Alara watched from behind the lace curtains as he descended. He moved with the same unnerving purpose as the night before. The meeting in her father's study was brutally efficient. Alara was summoned, a lamb to a very gilded, very cold altar. The Duke stood as she entered. He inclined his head, a gesture devoid of warmth. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, assessed her for a moment. She felt like a specimen under glass. "Lady Alara," he said, his voice as chillingly formal as his presence. She curtsied, her knees trembling slightly. "Your Grace." Her father, looking small and flustered behind his large desk, cleared his throat. "Your Grace, this is highly unconventional." "I am not a conventional man, Lord Stirling," the Duke replied, his gaze not leaving Alara's face. "I made my intentions clear. I require a duchess. Your daughter is of suitable birth. The settlements will be more than generous. They will, in fact, resolve all of your outstanding financial difficulties." It was a transaction, a cold, clean purchase. Alara felt a wave of nausea. He was buying her, the damaged goods Lord Finchley had mocked, to settle her family's debts. The humiliation was so profound, it became a strange, detached numbness. The wedding was a week later. It was a small, somber affair, attended by only the closest family. Alara wore a simple cream gown, her face obscured by a thick lace veil, a mercy for which she was grateful. She stood beside the Duke at the altar, a man who was a complete stranger to her, and pledged her life to him. He did not smile. His vows were spoken in that same flat, emotionless tone. When he lifted her veil to place a chaste, fleeting kiss on her lips, his eyes were unreadable pools of grey. For a single, startling moment, as his cool lips brushed hers, she thought she saw a flicker of something in their depths, something akin to pain. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared. Then she was the Duchess of Alistair, and her old life was over. Blackwood Manor, the Duke's ancestral home, was as imposing as its master. It was a vast, Gothic structure of grey stone that seemed to rise from the mist-shrouded earth like a jagged tooth. The halls were cavernous and silent, the portraits of his ancestors watching her with stern, painted eyes. The staff moved with a quiet efficiency that bordered on fear. Their life together began as a series of formal, awkward interactions. They were two friendly strangers sharing a monumentally large and silent house. They dined together each evening at opposite ends of a long, polished table, the distance between them a vast, unbridgeable chasm. Their conversation was polite, stilted, and utterly impersonal. "Was your day satisfactory, Your Grace?" she would ask. "It was productive," he would reply. "And yours?" "I found the library. It is quite extensive." "You may consider it your own." And that was that. He would retreat to his study after dinner, and she to her wing of the house. He never sought her out. He never touched her. She was a duchess in name only, a ghost haunting the corridors of his life, as she had once haunted the ballrooms of London. The loneliness was a different flavour here, grander, colder, but no less acute. Her one solace was the discovery of a small, glass-paned conservatory attached to the library. It was neglected, but filled with interesting, slightly wild flora. She began to spend her days there, and in the library, with her sketchbooks and watercolours. Her botanical illustrations had always been her private escape, a world where she could impose order and find beauty in the minute details of a petal or a leaf. Here, she had an endless supply of subjects. One afternoon, about a month into their strange marriage, she returned to her rooms to find a large, flat package wrapped in brown paper lying on her settee. There was no note. Her maid, Jane, knew nothing of it. With curious fingers, Alara unwrapped it. Inside were two enormous, leather-bound volumes. Her breath caught. They were first editions of Thornton's Temple of Flora, the holy grail for a botanical artist. The hand-coloured plates were exquisite, vibrant, and breathtakingly beautiful. Such a collection was priceless, impossibly rare. She knew, with a certainty that made her heart skip a beat. Who had sent them? Her husband. The cold, distant man who barely spoke to her had noticed her passion. He had observed her. This gift was not a generic offering. It was deeply personal, an acknowledgement of the woman hiding behind the title and the scar. A crack appeared in the icy armor of her perception of him. It was a small, hairline fracture, but it was there. The crack widened a few weeks later. They were hosting their first formal dinner party, a necessary evil of their station. Ilara dreaded it, dreaded the curious and pitying stares she knew she would receive. Lady Isabel Thornton, a renowned beauty who had once been considered a likely match for the Duke, was in attendance. Her presence was a constant, subtle torment. Throughout the meal, Lady Isabel directed a series of veiled barbs at Ilara, commenting on the drabness of country life and the importance of a duchess possessing certain social graces. Ilara endured it with quiet fortitude, her gaze fixed on her plate. Then, during a lull in the conversation, Lady Isabel looked directly at Ilara, a malicious glint in her eyes. "It must be such a relief, Your Grace," she said, her voice carrying across the table, "to be married. I imagine one with your disadvantage had quite given up hope." The insult was as sharp in public as a slap. The table fell silent. Ilara felt the blood drain from her face. She saw pity in the eyes of some guests, amusement in others. She braced herself for the Duke's cold indifference. Instead, he placed his wineglass down with a soft, deliberate click. The sound was as loud as a gunshot in the silent room. He did not look at Lady Isabel. He looked at his plate as he spoke, his voice dangerously soft. "Lady Isabel," he began, "my wife's beauty is of a kind you would never comprehend. It is found in intelligence, resilience, and a quiet strength that could extinguish a spirit as vapid as your own without a flicker of effort." He then lifted his eyes and met the woman's shocked gaze. "Do not speak of her again." The chill that descended upon the table was absolute. Lady Isabel turned a mortified shade of crimson. The rest of the dinner was a tense, muted affair. But Ilara barely noticed. Her mind was reeling. He had defended her. Not with a polite deflection, but with a verbal evisceration that had left their tormentor speechless. He had protected her, and he had called her beautiful. The words echoed in her heart, confusing and frightening and undeniably thrilling. Who was this man she had married? The quiet rhythm of their life at Blackwood Manor continued, but something within Ilara had shifted. The Duke was no longer just a cold, ruthless enigma. He was a man of startling contradictions, the giver of rare books and the defender of her honor. She found herself watching him, studying the rigid set of his shoulders, the rare moments his guard seemed to drop, the way his eyes would sometimes find her across a room before quickly looking away. Curiosity, a feeling she had long suppressed, began to bloom within her like a stubborn, hardy flower. Her mother's visit was an unwelcome intrusion into this new, fragile state of uncertainty. She arrived in a flurry of silks and anxieties, her eyes darting around the grand, somber halls, as if expecting to find monsters lurking in the shadows. "Ilara, you look well," she said, though her eyes betrayed her doubt. "But this house, it's so severe. And him, is he kind to you?" "He is a perfect gentleman, Mother," Ilara replied truthfully. "But gentlemen can be cruel," her mother insisted, lowering her voice. "I hear things in London. The whispers have not ceased simply because you are his wife. They say he is a monster, Ilara, that he drove his last intended, Lady Annalise, to flee the country in the dead of night. What does a man like that want with you?" The words were a splash of icy water, reviving old fears. A monster? Had she married a monster? The thought coiled in her stomach. Why had he married her? The public, humiliating reason he had given no longer seemed sufficient to explain the man who gifted her priceless books and defended her with such quiet ferocity. The mystery of him deepened, and for the first time, a sliver of genuine fear pierced her growing curiosity. She tried to push her mother's warnings aside, focusing on her art. The gardens of Blackwood were her sanctuary. One crisp autumn afternoon, she was sketching a late-blooming rose near the edge of the formal gardens that bordered the rolling parkland. The air was still, the silence broken only by the scratching of her charcoal on the page. The sound came suddenly, a frantic thundering of hooves. Her head shot up. A massive black stallion from a neighboring estate, its eyes wide with panic, was galloping wildly across the park. A trailing rein snagged on a fallen branch, and it was heading directly for her. Ilara froze, her mind a blank slate of terror. The world narrowed to the charging beast, the churning turf, the inevitability of the impact. She did not see him coming. One moment she was paralyzed, the next, a powerful force slammed into her, knocking the air from her lungs. An arm like a steel band wrapped around her waist, lifting her off her feet and throwing them both sideways, out of the horse's path. They landed in a heap on the soft grass, the stallion thundering past just inches away. She lay there, gasping for breath, her cheek pressed against the rough tweed of a man's coat. The scent of winter air and old books filled her senses. It was him, the Duke. He was shielding her with his own body, his arms holding her with a desperate tightness. "Are you harmed?" His voice was ragged, a raw sound she had never heard before. She shook her head, unable to speak. He pushed himself up slightly, his hands framing her face, his thumbs gently brushing her cheeks. His face was pale, his composure shattered. And in his eyes, for one unguarded moment, she saw it clearly. Not coldness, not indifference, but raw, undiluted fear. It was the look of a man who had come terrifyingly close to losing something precious. The moment was shattered as quickly as it began. He seemed to realize how close they were, the intimacy of his touch. The mask of iron control slammed back into place. He released her, his expression becoming shuttered and remote once more. He stood, pulling her to her feet with a formal, impersonal grip. "You should be more careful," he said, his voice clipped and cool again. He turned and strode back toward the house without another word, his back ramrod straight. Ilara stood alone in the garden, her body trembling with adrenaline and something else entirely. She raised a hand to her cheek, where the ghost of his touch still lingered. He had saved her. He had held her as if she were the most important thing in the world. And he had been afraid for her. The contradiction of the man was a maddening, compelling puzzle. The fear her mother had instilled in her battled with the undeniable evidence of his protection. She knew then that she could no longer live in this state of uncertainty. She had to know the truth. She had to understand the heart of the man she had married. Driven by a resolve she hadn't known she possessed, Ilara spent the next days searching for him. Not in the library or his study, the formal spaces they occupied, but in the hidden corners of the vast estate. She felt like a detective, piecing together the fragments of a man who revealed nothing of himself. Her search led her to a part of the grounds she had never explored, a section of old woods shielded by a crumbling stone wall. Beyond the wall lay a small, forgotten cemetery. Most of the headstones were ancient and covered in moss, tilting like crooked teeth. But one grave, near a weeping willow, was different. It was small, clearly that of a child, and immaculately tended. Fresh wildflowers, now slightly wilted, lay before a simple stone marker. He was there. He was not dressed as the formidable Duke, but in simple riding breeches and a linen shirt, his back to her. He was kneeling before the small grave, his head bowed, his broad shoulders slumped in a posture of profound grief. The sight was so intensely private, so vulnerable, that she almost retreated. But the need to understand was stronger than her sense of propriety. She took a step forward, the crunch of a twig under her foot announcing her presence. He stiffened, his head snapping up. He rose to his feet in one fluid motion, turning to face her. The mask was in place, but his eyes were shadowed with a pain so deep it stole her breath. "You should not be here," he said, his voice low and strained. "I had to find you," she replied, her own voice steady despite the frantic beating of her heart. She gestured toward the grave. "Who is buried here?" A muscle feathered in his jaw. "It is a private matter." "I am your wife," she said, the words feeling true for the very first time. "Alistair." Using his given name felt like a momentous transgression, but she did not back down. "I will not be a stranger in my own life any longer. I need to know the truth. Why did you marry me? Not the reason you gave my father, or the cruel pronouncement you made at the ball. The real reason." He stared at her, a long, silent battle raging in his eyes. The wind whispered through the willow branches, a mournful sound. She thought he would turn away, would shut her out as he always did. But instead, he let out a long, shuddering breath, a sound of utter defeat. He looked from her face to the small headstone and back again. "Her name was Lily," he said, his voice cracking on the single word. "She was my sister, my younger sister." He began to speak, the words emerging slowly at first, then in a torrent, as if a dam had finally broken. He spoke of a summer day 15 years prior. He was a boy of 17, charged with watching his 7-year-old sister as she played by the river that bordered their estate. There was a fire, a sudden blaze in a tenant farmer's barn nearby. For a few critical moments, his attention was diverted by the smoke, the shouts, the chaos. "When I looked back," he whispered, his voice raw with ancient guilt, "she was gone. She had fallen into the river. The current was strong." He told of his panic, his desperate, useless search. And then he spoke of another child, a young girl visiting a neighboring estate for the day. A girl with her sketchbook who had seen Lily fall. "This girl," he said, his eyes locking with Alara's. She didn't hesitate. She scrambled down the bank trying to reach Lily, trying to pull her out. She was so small, but so brave. His voice choked. A burning timber fell from the barn roof. It struck the bank near her, and a piece of it caught her. Alara's hand flew to her cheek, her fingers tracing the familiar raised line of her scar. The memory, long buried under a haze of childhood trauma, rushed back with stunning clarity. The smell of smoke, the cold shock of the river water, the searing, blinding pain on her face, a small hand slipping from her grasp. "It was you," he said, his voice barely audible. "It was always you." The world seemed to spin, the ground unsteady beneath her feet. He had known. All this time, he had known who she was. "We pulled you both from the water," he continued, his gaze distant, lost in the horror of the memory. "But it was too late for Lily. And you carried the mark of that day, a mark of your courage." His eyes filled with unshed tears. "And my failure." The truth settled upon her, vast and overwhelming. His coldness, his distance. It wasn't about her. It was about him, his guilt. "I watched you from a distance for years," he confessed, his voice thick with emotion. "I saw you at social events, always in the shadows, overlooked. I saw how people stared at your scar, the scar you received trying to save my sister. They saw a flaw, a blemish. All I saw was a hero. I fell in love with a ghost, a memory of the bravest girl I had ever seen." He looked at her then, his soul bare in his eyes. "I was a coward. I couldn't approach you. I felt unworthy of even speaking your name. I thought my guilt would taint you. But then I heard Finchley, talking about you with such contempt, planning to force your family's hand. The thought of you belonging to a man like that, it was unbearable. So I acted. My proposal, it was a clumsy, desperate, cruel act. I hurt you to save you. It is the most unforgivable thing I have ever done." He stood before her, the powerful, ruthless Duke of Alistair, utterly exposed. He was not a monster. He was a man drowning in grief and a love he felt he did not deserve. A man who had carried a torch for her for 15 years, seeing beauty where she saw only a flaw. Ilara looked at this broken man, and the last of her fear dissolved, replaced by a wave of profound, aching empathy. All the lonely years, all the moments of feeling invisible and unworthy, coalesced into a single point of stunning clarity. She had not been alone in her isolation. He had been there, in his own self-imposed prison, watching over her. She did not feel anger at his deception. She felt a shared sorrow for the years they had lost, for the pain he had carried alone. The man who had publicly shamed her had secretly worshipped her. The man who seemed to see through her had, in fact, been the only one to ever truly see her at all. Slowly, she closed the distance between them. She reached out, her fingers trembling slightly, and laid her hand on his arm. The muscle beneath his sleeve was rigid with tension. He flinched at her touch, as if expecting a blow. "You saw a hero," she said, her voice soft but clear in the quiet of the cemetery. "All I remember is being a little girl who failed, a girl who couldn't hold on." He looked down at her, his expression shattering. "You did not fail," he whispered, his voice thick. "You were the only one who tried." He lifted his hand, his movements hesitant, as if he feared she might bolt. With infinite gentleness, his fingers traced the line of her scar, from her brow to her cheek. His touch was not one of pity or clinical curiosity. It was a caress of reverence, of awe. It was the touch of a man finally allowing himself to hold something he considered sacred. "I have dreamt of this," he breathed, "of being able to thank you." In that moment, she understood. Her scar was not a wall that had kept him away. It was a beacon that had guided him, a constant, painful reminder of a debt he felt he could never repay. She had defined herself by her flaw, but he had defined her by her strength. "There is nothing to thank me for," she said, "and nothing to forgive." She saw the decision in his eyes before he moved. He leaned in slowly, giving her every chance to turn away. She did not. She stood her ground, her heart hammering not with fear, but with a dizzying, soaring hope. His lips met hers. It was not like the cold, formal kiss at the altar. This was a kiss of profound release, a culmination of 15 years of unspoken grief and silent adoration. It was gentle, questioning, and filled with a sorrow so deep it made her ache. It was a kiss that spoke of gratitude, of apology, of a desperate, lonely love finally finding its harbor. She felt the wetness of a tear on her cheek, and did not know if it was his or her own. When he finally pulled away, the space between them was no longer a chasm of silence, but a fragile, sacred ground of shared understanding. They had found each other in a graveyard, two lonely souls brought together by a tragedy that had shaped both their lives. A year later, the sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the conservatory at Blackwood Manor. The room was no longer neglected, but was a riot of life and colour, filled to bursting with the exotic flowers and lush ferns that Ilara so loved to paint. The air was warm and smelled of damp earth and sweet blossoms. The entire manor, once so cold and severe, seemed to have taken a contented breath, its stone walls now warmed by laughter and light. Ilara sat at her easel, putting the finishing touches on a watercolour of a rare orchid. A pair of strong arms wrapped around her from behind, and a familiar chin rested gently on her shoulder. "It is beautiful," Alistair murmured, his voice a low, warm rumble against her ear. She smiled, leaning back into his embrace. "The subject matter is inspiring." He was a changed man. The formidable, iron-willed Duke was still there when the world required him. But here, with her, he was simply Alistair. The harsh lines of his face had softened. The perpetual winter in his eyes had thawed, replaced by a warmth that was reserved for her alone. He smiled now, a true, easy smile that transformed his entire countenance. It was a sight that still made her heart perform a little flutter. He turned her chair to face him and knelt before her, taking her hand in his. His thumb brushed over her knuckles. It was a simple, everyday gesture, but it was filled with a quiet intimacy that was the bedrock of their new life. "Do you ever miss it?" he asked, his expression serious. "The season? The balls?" Ilara thought of the stuffy ballrooms, the cruel whispers, the suffocating feeling of being invisible. She looked around her vibrant sanctuary, at the man who saw her more clearly than anyone, and a laugh escaped her. "I miss it like a caged bird misses its bars," she said. "My world is infinitely larger now than it ever was in London." His eyes shone with love and relief. "I often think," he said softly, "of all the years we lost. Of all the time I spent watching you from afar, too afraid to speak." Ilara reached out and touched his cheek, her fingers brushing against the faint stubble of his jaw. "We did not lose those years, Alistair. We were simply finding our way to each other on different paths. You needed to heal, and I needed to learn that I was more than what society saw." She had come to realize that some scars were etched on the skin, visible for all to judge, while others were carried deep inside, hidden from the world. She had spent her life thinking her mark was a curse that had rendered her ugly and unlovable. But she was wrong. It had been a signpost, a painful but enduring symbol of a moment of courage that had captured the heart of the only man who mattered. He had thought his guilt made him a monster, but his quiet, patient vigil had been the most profound act of love she could imagine. True sight, she had learned, was not about seeing perfection. It was about looking past the surface to recognize the beautiful, flawed, and resilient story written on a person's soul. Her life was no longer a placid, stagnant lake. It was a flourishing garden, cultivated with patience, understanding, and a love that had been strong enough to wait.